Imagine the most powerful man in the world
Right.
sitting entirely alone in this like sterile, brightly lit room, and he's trying to write a single sentence to justify a war.
Oh, wow.
He brings his pen to the paper, right? And he writes, "It is recommended that," and then his hand just stops.
It just completely stops.
Yeah, he crosses it out, he tries again, "It is recommended that," and he stops again. He literally, he cannot find the words to order people to die.
It is such a profound image
Yeah.
because it perfectly captures that paralysis, that moment when the sterile machinery of government crashes headfirst into the actual messy reality of human conscience.
Exactly. And today we're looking at exactly what happens in that terrifying silence. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are exploring an absolutely brilliant, just incredibly haunting piece of source material.
It really is.
It's a play script titled Ashes and Echoes, written by Fareed Novin, and it was published pretty recently on April 13, 2026. And our mission today is to look at the anatomy of impossible decisions. We're going to examine how powerful people justify the unjustifiable, like extracting the most fascinating philosophical arguments from this text to really understand how self-deception operates at the highest levels of power.
And I mean, the setup of this play is just conceptually staggering. The playwright takes 5 historical figures from the American Vietnam War era.
Right, the heavy hitters.
Yeah, Lyndon B. Johnson, Robert McNamara, Richard Nixon, Henry Kissinger, and Hubert Humphrey. And he places them all together in a room. But the catch is, they aren't alone.
This is the best part.
As they debate, 4 philosophical visitors are introduced into the space to observe and basically dissect their logic. We get Bertolt Brecht, Samuel Beckett, Friedrich Nietzsche, and the poet Rumi.
Which is just a wild dinner party lineup, honestly. But before we really get into the weeds here, I need to make something crystal clear to you, the listener. Because obviously, this source material touches on highly charged political history involving both left-wing and right-wing historical figures.
Highly charged is an understatement.
Totally. So as your guides on this deep dive, we are completely impartial. We are not endorsing any political viewpoints, and we're not condemning or championing any of these specific figures.
Right, we're just analyzing the text.
Exactly. We are simply unpacking the fascinating ideas and the philosophical arguments exactly as they are presented in the original text. So, okay, let's unpack this, because we have to start by understanding the environment where these decisions are actually being made.
Yeah, and what's fascinating here is the physical setting of the play itself. It takes place in the White House Situation Room, but, and this is key, the production notes explicitly state that time in this room does not move forward normally.
It's all warped.
Exactly. It moves against itself. Scenes overlap. And underneath it all, the playwright dictates this specific, constant audio element. He calls it the mechanical hum.
The mechanical hum. And the text says this hum is the sound of systems. It's a noise that should be felt in the chest of the audience more than, heard by their ears.
Yeah, like a vibration.
And it never, ever stops. It's just always there, grinding away beneath every single line of dialogue.
Which is just the perfect auditory manifestation of bureaucracy.
Yeah.
It's the machinery of state, that endless churning of procedure. And we see how that machinery dictates human behavior immediately in the first major scene, which is set roughly around 1965.
Right.
Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, is standing at a table presenting these precise mathematical models of bombing sorties.
Just entirely numbers.
Right. He isn't talking about towns or people. He's talking about tonnage, cost variables, and what he calls logarithmic disruption.
Okay, we need to pause on that phrase, logarithmic disruption. It sounds so clean, doesn't it?
It sounds like a tech startup metric.
Exactly. But what he is actually describing is viewing human destruction purely as an exponential math curve. It completely abstracts the absolute horror of a bombing campaign into this, sterile line on a graph.
Right.
And Vice President Hubert Humphrey actually tries to stop him. Humphrey tries to ask a fundamental ethical question like, what are we actually doing here?
He zeroes right in on the language.
Yeah, he zeroes in on the fact that McNamara is referring to civilian casualties merely as a, quote, cost variable. But then President Johnson shuts Humphrey down completely with just one question. He just looks at him and asks, what's the alternative, Hubert?
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, this is where the playwright brings in Bertolt Brecht to comment. Brecht steps forward and points out that this exchange right here is exactly how the machinery of power neutralizes morality.
It's a trick.
It is. It's a grammatical trick. You take an ethical question like, should we do this, and you transform it into a procedural one.
By demanding the alternative.
Exactly. By demanding what is the alternative to what we were already doing,
Hmm.
or you completely bypass the morality of the action itself. I mean, if you don't have a fully fleshed out logistical alternative ready to present, you aren't even allowed to participate in the argument.
Yeah.
The ethical objection is just dismissed as irrelevant.
Okay, but hold on. I have to push back on this a little bit.
Sure.
Because aren't models and data and alternatives necessary for any big decision? I mean, you can't run a country on vibes, right? Or just purely on moral intuition.
Well, no, of course not.
You need cost variables and logistical projections when you're managing millions of lives and finite resources. Without the math, you just have chaos.
That is a completely valid point. And the play, to be fair, doesn't argue that mathematics or data are inherently evil.
Yeah.
The necessity of planning isn't the problem at all.
So what's the actual danger?
The specific danger the play highlights is the illusion of precision. The danger isn't the data itself. It's the arrogant belief that if you describe something with enough mathematical precision, you have truly deeply understood it,
Oh, wow.
right? McNamara genuinely believes his models are neutral. He operates under this assumption that because numbers don't weep at funerals, they must be objective truth.
He thinks the math absolves him of the morality. But the problem is, like the text notes, numbers are never truly neutral. They are just the argument dressed up as undeniable evidence. Which brings us right back to that incredible opening image we started with. Because eventually all this reliance on math and procedure hits a concrete wall. We shift from the illusion of precision to this agonizing moment where the math fails and language completely collapses.
Yes, this is the scene you described at the very beginning, where McNamara is trying to write that simple policy memorandum to recommend escalating the bombing.
Yeah.
He has all the math, he has all the logarithmic disruption charts right in front of him, but he repeatedly writes, "It is recommended that," and then he stops. He crosses it out. He literally cannot finish the sentence.
And into this agonizing silence, the playwright brings Samuel Beckett.
Yep.
And Beckett gives this devastating commentary. He tells McNamara that this exact incomplete sentence has been sitting there in rooms of power for 300 years.
300 years.
Yeah. Generals, kings, politicians across centuries have all arrived at this exact point. A perfectly constructed procedural sentence that stops right before it has to say the actually physical thing it means.
Which raises such an important question about how we use words to hide from our actions. Beckett diagnoses this as the defining phenomenon of political history. He calls it the massive gap between the language of decision and the content of decision.
The language versus the content.
Right. You see, McNamara's mathematical models can compute human death as a variable, but those models cannot tell him how to write the sentence that bridges the gap between cold computation and the actual physical order to obliterate a village.
And think about how relatable this is for you listening right now. Obviously, we aren't writing war memos, but we see this mechanism everywhere.
Oh, absolutely. In everyday life.
Have you ever noticed how a corporation will use the word downsizing or synergistic restructuring?
Yeah, just to avoid saying we are firing people.
Exactly. To avoid saying we are firing people who have mortgages to pay. We all use professional jargon to distance ourselves from the messy, painful reality of our choices. And in the play, when McNamara finally forces himself to push through and finish the memo, he sighs, puts down his pen, and says he feels like he's done his job.
Which is just, it prompts Beckett to say that I have done my job is the worst possible answer he could have given.
Oh.
But tragically, is perhaps the only honest one.
Because he deferred to the system.
Exactly. By completing the bureaucratic procedure, McNamara feels the moral weight has been successfully transferred off his own shoulders and onto the system. The system demanded a memo, he provided the memo.
He hides behind the procedure. But what happens when a leader can't hide? Because once a leader realizes the math has failed and the situation is unraveling, their psychological survival mechanism has to shift.
It really does.
And we see this shift vividly when the play focuses on Lyndon B. Johnson. LBJ doesn't have a language problem like McNamara. He has a terrifying clarity problem.
Yes. LBJ's psychological burden is entirely different. He is not deceived by the math, and he isn't hiding behind jargon.
He knows exactly what's happening. And the script gives LBJ this incredibly vivid, haunting dream to explain his state of mind. LBJ tells the room he dreamt he was standing in the middle of the fast-moving Pedernales River down in Texas.
Such a powerful scene.
It really is. He is standing waist deep, and he is trying to hold the rushing water back with his bare hands. The water is just crashing past him, drowning everything downstream, but he just keeps standing there with his hands pushed out against the current.
Right.
And he explicitly notes that in the dream, he wasn't afraid. He wasn't sad. He was furious. He was absolutely certain that if he just wanted it badly enough, if he just exerted enough willpower, he could make the river stop.
It is such a profound image. I mean, it's an image of monumental hubris, but it's also the image of a man trapped by his own immense power. He knows the men downstream are drowning. He knows his actions are failing.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because it's the ultimate sunk cost fallacy, but playing out on a catastrophic historical scale.
Totally.
You've invested so much blood, so much treasure, and so much of your own ego that you feel you literally cannot stop. Because stopping means admitting that all the previous costs, all those lost lives, were for absolutely nothing.
Right. It means accepting the failure.
Exactly. LBJ looks at the room and says, stopping is also a decision, and every decision now costs something he can't calculate and can't take back.
And what's fascinating here is how the philosopher Rumi and Friedrich Nietzsche step in to dissect LBJ's paralysis.
Yeah, their analysis is brutal.
It really is. Rumi observes from the margins, pointing out the absolute tragedy of a man acting against his own knowing. Rumi sees that LBJ feels the truth in his bones, like he knows the war is lost, yet he continues the escalation anyway. It's a spiritual agony.
And Nietzsche takes that observation and just twists the knife.
He absolutely does. Nietzsche dismantles that comforting idea we all hold, that these leaders are just confused victims of circumstance who would do the right thing if they only saw the reality clearly.
Right, that they're just myth-informed.
Exactly. Nietzsche says, no, these men are not confused at all. The choice precedes the justification. They've already decided what they're going to do based on power, pride, or fear, and everything that follows, the math, the memos, the agonizing debates, is just a performance. They are, in Nietzsche's words, staging a necessity.
Staging a necessity. Wow. Yeah. They make the raw, ugly choice first, and then they build the complex mathematical models to make that choice look like it was the only logical, necessary option.
Exactly that.
It's like they're painstakingly building a steel cage around themselves and then complaining to the world that they are trapped.
That is a perfect way to put it. And once that cage is built and the reality that the war is unwinnable really sets in, the objective of the leaders changes entirely. They stop trying to solve the problem and start trying to manage the perception of the problem.
Which is exactly what happens when the play jumps forward in time to Richard Nixon and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger.
Act 2.
Right. And the shift in tone here is jarring. I mean, with LBJ and McNamara, there was at least a struggle, you know. But with Nixon and Kissinger, the question isn't how to win the war or even how to save lives. The only question in the room becomes, how do we leave a situation we know is completely doomed without looking like we lost?
It is a masterclass in the cynical management of failure. Nixon and Kissinger are having this cold, incredibly calculated conversation. They both privately, explicitly agree the war is unwinnable.
They know it's over.
Yeah, Kissinger admits he concluded that a long time ago. But Nixon insists that they cannot appear to lose because that would destroy the global perception of American resolve and power.
And Kissinger talks about how he survives this massive cognitive dissonance. Like, how do you go to work every day knowing you are fighting a lost cause?
It's wild.
He admits to Beckett that he has developed a vocabulary of consequence. It's this specialized, heavily sanitized language designed specifically to carry the weight of this disjunction between what he knows is true and what he must officially sanction.
And if we look at how a vocabulary of consequence works in practice, it's really about neutralizing reality. You don't call it a defeat. You call it a strategic realignment.
Right.
You don't call it a retreat. You call it a phased transition. You use words to build a fortress around your failure.
Yeah.
Which brings us to the crux of their scene and arguably one of the most chilling moments in the entire text.
A withdrawal plan.
Yes.
Yeah.
They need to figure out how to pull out of the country. So they devise a plan. They decide to withdraw American forces slowly and transfer power to the South Vietnamese government, knowing full well that the South Vietnamese government will eventually collapse.
Wait, let me make sure I'm getting this exactly right. They are actively designing a delayed collapse, purely for plausible deniability.
Precisely.
That's insane.
Kissinger explicitly says the goal is to stretch the timeline of the withdrawal out for a year or two. He wants to leave a decent interval. long enough so that when the inevitable violent fall of the country happens, the causal connection becomes arguable.
Oh my God.
They are deliberately manufacturing a delay, knowing that thousands of additional people will die during that artificially extended timeline, just so they won't be historically blamed for the final collapse. They want the gap in time to be their alibi.
That is just staggering. I mean, it's one thing to make a terrible mistake in the heat of a conflict. It is an entirely different level of darkness to engineer the timeline of a tragedy purely for public relations purposes.
It really is. And this raises an important question about power. And Nietzsche steps in during this scene to give this behavior a name. He calls it the will to power applied to the past.
The will to power applied to the past.
Yeah. Since Nixon and Kissinger cannot change the physical fact that they are losing the war, they use their immense power to manipulate the definition and the timeline of the loss. They're trying to rewrite history before it has even finished happening. They're trying to outsmart time itself.
Which brings us to the final act of the play, the aftermath. After the memos are forced onto the page, after the delays are cynically engineered, the machinery finally grinds to a halt.
The room empties out.
Yeah, the Situation Room empties out. And the question the text leaves us with is, what remains?
This is where Rumi steps fully into the light and asks the historical figures the most piercing, devastating question of the entire play. They have spent all this time debating the logistics, the math, the politics of leaving, but Rumi looks at them and asks, where do you go? What do you carry with you into the room you sleep in?
It's the ultimate question of historical and personal accounting. And the play shows us McNamara, much older now, trying to reckon with that exact question.
Decades later.
Right. He talks about the memoir he wrote decades later where he finally apologized and admitted that his models were wrong. He says he realized far too late that he was trying to model human lives as if they were a mechanical system, and he admits he never accounted for the faces.
And Beckett delivers this incredibly harsh but necessary truth about McNamara's late apology. Beckett tells McNamara that the apology was still worth saying, but it was fundamentally too late.
Too late.
And by too late, Beckett doesn't just mean a few years delayed. He means that language cannot reach back through the fabric of time and unwind a physical decision made in 1965. Time only moves one way. You cannot undo the physical doing with the subsequent saying, the bombs still fell.
Wow. And the play then gives us this beautiful, absolutely gut-wrenching analogy from Rumi about the reed flute.
Oh, this part is beautiful.
Rumi explains that in his tradition, there's an image of a reed that is cut from its bed in the earth to be made into an instrument. And it makes beautiful music, but the music is born entirely out of the wound of its separation from its home. The music is fundamentally a sound of grief.
It is a profound metaphor for everyone involved in this dark history. Rumi looks at these powerful men and says that they are all some version of that reed. They are making a sound out of a cut. They're producing history out of a wound.
Yeah.
And he asks them, can you hear what you are playing? Because a reed that plays its music without knowing what it is making is the most dangerous instrument in the world.
Can you hear what you are playing? That gives me chills just thinking about it. And speaking of what is heard and what is unseen, there is a production note in the text that we absolutely have to talk about before we finish because it ties everything together.
The note on the staging.
Yes, the playwright explicitly dictates how the play should be staged regarding the Vietnamese people.
Right. The note on the absent. The playwright dictates that the Vietnamese people, the millions of lives downstream of these decisions, the people who actually suffered the logarithmic disruption, are deliberately kept entirely off stage. They are kept at the level of implication. We never see them.
And the playwright explains exactly why he made that choice. There's a moment in the script where it refuses to show the famous, tragic visual of the fall of Saigon. You know, the desperate people climbing up to the helicopter on the roof of the embassy.
The iconic photo.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The voice of Brecht tells the audience that giving them that visual representation would actually be a kind of emotional relief. It would give the audience somewhere to put all the complicated feelings of guilt and horror.
It is a brilliant, entirely subversive theatrical choice. By withholding the visual of the victims, their absence becomes a heavy, suffocating structural weight in the room.
Because you can't look away from the perpetrators.
Exactly. If the play showed you the victims, you could cry. You could feel pity. You could experience catharsis and leave the theater feeling like you had done your emotional duty. But the play denies you that release. It forces you to just sit with the unbearable, sterile discomfort of the Situation Room. It traps you in the room where the math was done, with the mechanical hum grinding in your chest.
So what does this all mean? What does this mean for you? listening to this right now. You might not be a president or a defense secretary or a general.
Hopefully not in this context.
Right. But the underlying themes of this play touch all of us. We all face moments where we use procedural language or corporate jargon to hide from the ethical realities of our everyday actions. We all participate in systems, whether they are corporate, social, or political, that have that low, constant mechanical hum of procedure, grinding away at our human empathy.
And the play serves as a profound warning against that hum. It challenges us to stay awake to the actual human costs of our choices, to recognize when we are slipping and turning a moral "should we" into a procedural "what's the alternative?"
Yeah,
It demands that we actively listen to the music we are playing in the world.
it really does. And the text offers this optional epilogue that I think leaves us with the perfect provocative thought to mull over.
The 1995 meeting.
Yeah. The script describes a real historical moment from 1995. Robert McNamara travels to Vietnam decades after the war, and he meets face-to-face with General Giap, the man who spent his entire life fighting against everything McNamara's mathematical models built.
And McNamara looks at Jap across a table and finally says the words to him directly. "We were wrong. Terribly wrong."
And General Giap just looks at him. And after a very long silence, Giap asks, "Why did it take so long to admit what you knew?"
The epilogue notes that McNamara didn't have an answer. But more importantly, the play suggests that the question didn't actually need one. The question is the answer.
It's the haunting question that history continually asks us all. Why does it take us so long to admit what we know? We constantly want history to be a clean story, a clear narrative pointing out the villain so we can feel safe in our own righteousness.
It's a comforting thought, but it's not real.
No, it's not. The terrifying reality this play exposes is that disaster doesn't come from a monster. It comes from ordinary people, trapped by their own prestige, listening to the mechanical hum of a system and choosing the comfort of procedure over the terrible, heavy burden of stopping. And the scariest part, that hum is still playing. It never really stops.